Iansan Nightsoul Points are supposed to drop when you're not moving. So why do they tick up sometimes? How much do her constellations really boost the damage of a team? What about keeping her buffs going with different combos, or setting up Cinder City for teams with 3 elements? In this episode of 7 advanced tips for every Iansan lane, we will be answering all these questions and more. So let's start right away. As you know, Iansan can buff attack to the active character based on a portion of her total attack, up to 690 or 810 depending on burst level. If your Nightsoul points are equal or above 42, you get the better conversion of 27% of her attack. The chart shows how much you need for each burst level. Remember that this is total attack, and it can include things like Noblesse or Pyro Resonance. But if Iansan Nightsoul points are below 42, then you get a worse attack conversion, which is also based on how many points are left exactly. Since the points keep going down, to maintain them, every character's movement excluding Iansan will be tracked and generate points. We will talk more in depth about this movement mechanics, but I want to first point out something I think a lot of people don't realize. You don't lose the buff by being below 42 Nightsoul points. You get a worse conversion, but with the same cap. If your build is good enough, you can even get the maximum amount of attack with far less movement. For example, if your Iansan had 4000 attack, yes, this is a lot, but it's very achievable, especially in overload teams. In this case, Iansan would still give you the maximum attack buff at 35 Nightsoul points. This is quite below the 54 she starts with. Of course, this is harder with a C5 since the cap is higher, but so is the attack required. But all this is to say that the 42 Nightsoul point rule is just to access a better conversion from your total attack, but it's not mandatory, even for the full buff. So you shouldn't immediately discard a team or a character just because you see this icon every now and then, which by the way indicates if you are at 42 plus or below. But this brings me to talk about a certain weapon that many are using. Tamayuratei is a recent and pretty common event weapon that synergizes with Iansan. You get high base attack, energy recharge, and when you skill you also get a whopping 40% attack. However, it lasts 10 seconds, and Iansan buff lasts 12 seconds, without C6, and 15 with it. Which means that if you achieve the amount of attack that you need including the effect of this weapon, you might not have it all the last 2 seconds or 5 seconds. It doesn't make the weapon bad by any means, but it's important to point out. There are ways to overcome this, like splitting Iansan's skill and burst, but they are way too specific to a given team to always consider. And of course, any attack buff can have this issue, when it doesn't match the uptime of her burst. Now, I want to talk about her movement tracking and explain what is happening here, where I'm literally standing still, nothing is happening, and my Nightsoul points go down as expected, but sometimes there is a small bounce back. We will use these findings to showcase combos and adjustments that characters can do to maximize their movement. What's really happening is that the tracking doesn't stop at horizontal and vertical movement, but actually tracks everything, like even very tiny body motions. And this gives you almost no points at all, but are enough to activate her Ascension 1, that gives her 1 full Nightsoul point. So let's say that a character, I don't know, breathing, is giving Iansan a made up number of 0.001 Nightsoul points. Well, that gets increased to 1.001 because of this passive. This also means that certain burst animations will function better than others. Even if the character completely disappears, thus not really moving, the small body adjustments will still account for something. Think of Clarent, Alight, and Kachink. While animations that do change the position of a character, think Varesa, will impact Iansan's Nightsoul points much better. But of course the main way to keep those up stays moving horizontally or vertically. Any plunge character will have no issues doing this. Characters from Natlan also have it easy thanks to Iansan's passive, but for others it can be tricky. I'll leave you with an example. Arlecchino does a very poor job at keeping Iansan's buff up. However, many attacks in the game move your character slightly, and the presence of an enemy nearby makes this movement greater. It's a way to make the game feel smoother. In the case of Arlecchino, this movement is pretty noticeable, and it's basically a dash towards the enemy. So her established combo of 3 normal attacks into a dash can be done to utilize this approaching mechanic by simply always dashing away from the target. The time lost doing this is very negligible, and it actually manages to keep Iansan above 42 Nightsoul points. Similar combo adjustments are very dependent on the character. A charge attack unit can dash after each one. A light item can take the longest route to a plunge instead of the shortest one, and then also insert a dash in his combo. Wanderer can also dash after each ascension for trigger, or Chaska can keep hovering around, but to be honest, the value of Iansan for these characters is not always up there. But a small combo adjustment can also happen to Iansan herself. Remember that her skill provides a full bar of Nightsoul Points, and the burst also provides a few, and it's tied to the attack buff. So generally you want to skill into burst. It's also good for energy and buff uptime. However, if you don't have C2, you also want to be casting her special charger attack. This can be done when she is in Nightsoul Blasting state, but requires a normal attack to do so, unless you follow up her skill with a simple tap attack. The combo now becomes skill, charged, a single tap attack will activate the charger attack into burst. We want to cast this to activate Ascension 1. Now she gets extra Nightsoul Points and a basically permanent plus 20% attack to herself. You don't need to do this if you have her C2. Skill into burst will activate everything plus one more attack buff for the on-fielder. However, even past C2, the charger attack can have some very interesting tricks. So let's talk about Cinder City. This buff is one of the main reasons why Iansan is comparable to so many great supports in the game, especially at lower constellations. The set is tied to a specific condition, which is triggering a reaction that includes the element you want to buff. Often it doesn't matter. An Overload will do everything we need in a Shivers team, an Electrocharged everything we need in a Taser team. But it's a problem when dealing damage of more than one element that doesn't include Electro. What if I'm playing Chaska, who is dealing damage of 3 different elements? Or a Kinich plus Mavuka team? Can we still set them up? Kinich Mavuka Emily sounds awkward, but it's pretty nuts in terms of damage, and Iansan, to my surprise, is actually able to activate Cinder City for the entire team. There are a lot of setups. I'll leave you with the one that I think makes the most sense, but I will likely upload a few more on my second channel. We Mavuka skill into Emily's skill. Here Iansan's skill and charge attack will consume all the burning aura, buffing Pyro, and then the burst will be able to react on the danger aura left, triggering Quicken and buffing Emily and Kinich. The result is insane for this team, and this is something that might be useful even if you're playing a much cheaper Kinich team. Surely setups where you just apply Danger and then go to Iansan are easy and straightforward, but your second rotation will likely start with a Burning Aura that kind of requires this Iansan combo. For Chaska it gets really weird. I don't think it's worth min-maxing because her Ascension 4 can mess up many setups, but what you're seeing is one with Furina plus Bennett, in which all 3 elements are getting the 40% scroll buff. You can get very creative. If you have a specific team in mind, comment below if you need help setting it up. Up until now, I only talked about her very base kit and buffs. However, she has more in her constellations, and I want to show you some examples of how much the damage of a team goes up by unlocking these constellations. I have 3, Melt Mavuka, Kinich and Overload Chlorant. In a Mavuka team with Bennett and Silali, Iansan is able to make Silali use a different supportive set. Unlocking Iansan C2 will give Mavuka an extra 30% attack buff. This makes our overall damage go up by 5%. Unlocking C5 would raise the attack buff maximum to 810, now our team is dealing 8% more damage. And with C6 we get an extra 25% damage to the active character. With this constellation our damage has increased 18% in total. I'd like to point out that the C6 is not guaranteed to happen on every damage dealer, since it requires Iansan to overcap her Nightsoul Points. And that's exactly what happens to Chlorant. We can't assume a good uptime on this effect. So for Chlorant, this is how the team's damage changes. Everything is back on track for Kinich and the team gets an overall 14% increase with the C6. Now that we mentioned every buff and constellations and pretty much also explained the entire kit, we can talk about something that can be very interesting about Iansan. Well, rather about certain characters that can be paired with Iansan. In Genshin there are talents that are set to snapshot, meaning that they remember certain stats for their entire duration. But not every stat can be snapshot, and not every talent can snapshot in the first place. And this is a mechanic that Hoyo doesn't utilize much anymore, so I won't bother you with the details and I'll just link in the description a list of every character or buff that can use it. The most notable examples for Iansan are Fischl, Shanling and Beidou. This is a list of buffs that Iansan can give her teammates. The general rule is that if a stat is visible in a character's stat page, then it can be snapshot, which means that aside from her C6, every other buff she has can be snapshot. This is pretty huge for the 3 characters that I mentioned. I'm indeed stacking a lot of buffs here, but just look at how fast odds, together with Bennett, are dealing with these enemies. I know I'm stretching this a bit, but in case you are playing those characters, it's important to keep in mind, and might spawn some very interesting 4-star only team. Okay, the video is over, thank you so much for watching. I'll leave you with a question: which Wind Glider looks better on Iansan? The Inazuma one or the Ryoya one?